I found my mother's diary 3 weeks after her funeral, hidden inside an old cedar chest in her closet. For 36 years, I had been introduced at every gathering as my mother's difficult, complicated, hard-to-manage daughter. That single leather-bound journal was about to prove everything I believed about my childhood had been completely wrong. My name is Claire Bennett, and I grew up constantly apologizing for simply existing inside my own family home. My mother, Margaret, ran our household with quiet precision, favoring routines, appearances, and carefully managed public family reputation. My younger sister Jessica was 2 years behind me, sweet-faced, soft-spoken, and endlessly praised by every relative. From childhood, I noticed conversations always seemed to shift whenever I entered a room filled with relatives and neighbors. Aunts would whisper about how difficult I could be, while Jessica received compliments about her gentle, easygoing nature. I never understood exactly what made me difficult, since I earned good grades and rarely caused any real trouble. Still, the label followed me everywhere, whispered at holidays, repeated at school conferences, mentioned casually during family photographs. My mother would sigh dramatically whenever I asked reasonable questions, calling me stubborn instead of simply curious or observant. Jessica, meanwhile, could throw tantrums, break curfew, or lie outright, yet somehow always emerged looking innocent and misunderstood. I remember being 12 years old, confused why identical behaviors earned me punishment while Jessica received gentle understanding instead. My father worked long hours as an accountant, rarely home enough to notice these patterns unfolding inside our household. When he was home, he trusted my mother's judgment completely, never questioning her narrative about which daughter caused problems. By high school, I had accepted my role as the difficult one, internalizing blame for things I never actually did. I became quiet, cautious, and constantly apologetic, terrified of confirming whatever reputation my mother had built around me. Jessica flourished under constant praise, becoming increasingly confident while I shrank smaller inside our family's carefully managed dynamic. I excelled academically, hoping achievement might finally change how my mother spoke about me to relatives and friends. Instead, my success got reframed as showing off, another example proving I was somehow too intense, too much. Jessica's mediocre grades were celebrated enthusiastically, while my honor roll certificates gathered dust inside a forgotten kitchen drawer. I graduated high school quietly, without fanfare, while Jessica's average report card earned a celebratory family dinner outing. College became my escape, a place where nobody knew the difficult daughter narrative that defined my entire childhood identity. I studied graphic design, building a career slowly, deliberately distancing myself from constant family criticism and comparison. Jessica stayed close to home, working part-time jobs while receiving continuous financial and emotional support from our parents. Visits home became increasingly rare, though guilt always pulled me back for major holidays and important family occasions. Each visit reinforced the same painful pattern. My accomplishments minimized, while Jessica's smallest achievements received exaggerated celebration instead. I began therapy in my late 20s, slowly unpacking years of internalized blame and confusing childhood family dynamics. My therapist gently suggested my mother's behavior resembled favoritism, though I resisted that explanation for a long time initially. I loved my mother despite everything, desperately wanting to believe her criticism came from genuine concern, not manipulation. When I turned 30, my father passed away suddenly, leaving my mother increasingly dependent on both her daughters emotionally. Jessica moved back home temporarily, positioning herself as the supportive daughter while subtly undermining my long-distance relationship with mother. I called weekly, sent gifts, and visited monthly, yet somehow remained perpetually cast as the less devoted daughter. Family friends began repeating the same tired narrative, praising Jessica's closeness while questioning my apparent emotional distance from mother. I never corrected these assumptions publicly, believing confrontation would only confirm the difficult reputation attached to my name. My mother's health began declining slowly over the following years, requiring increased caregiving responsibilities from both her daughters. I took unpaid leave repeatedly, driving 3 hours each direction to help manage doctor appointments and medication schedules. Jessica, living just 15 minutes away, somehow managed fewer visits while receiving greater credit for caregiving efforts overall. I noticed this imbalance but stayed silent, unwilling to create additional family conflict during an already difficult time period. During one visit, I overheard my mother telling a neighbor that Jessica handled everything while I remained distant and unhelpful. That comment stung deeply, considering the exhaustion I felt after months of exhausting caregiving trips and sacrificed personal time. I confronted my mother gently, asking why she characterized my involvement so differently than the reality I experienced daily. She dismissed my concerns quickly, insisting I was being overly sensitive, another example of my supposedly difficult personality traits. Something inside me hardened slightly after that conversation, though I continued showing up anyway, hoping things might eventually improve. 2 years later, my mother's health declined rapidly, requiring hospice care during her final challenging months of life. I took extended leave from work, moving temporarily into my childhood home to help coordinate her end-of-life care. Jessica visited occasionally, though I managed most medical decisions, medication schedules, and difficult conversations with hospice care providers. During those final months, my mother rarely acknowledged my constant presence, instead praising Jessica's occasional brief visits enthusiastically. I told myself these final months mattered more than recognition, focusing entirely on ensuring my mother remained comfortable throughout. My mother passed away peacefully on a quiet Tuesday morning, with me sitting beside her hospital bed holding her hand. Jessica arrived 20 minutes after she passed, immediately taking charge of funeral arrangements and public grief announcements afterward. At the funeral, relatives approached Jessica offering condolences, praising her devotion, while barely acknowledging my presence beside the casket. Someone actually thanked Jessica for taking such wonderful care of our mother during her difficult final battle with illness. I stood there silently, exhausted from months of caregiving nobody seemed to remember or properly acknowledge that afternoon. After the funeral, I returned to my childhood home to begin sorting through decades of accumulated family belongings quietly. Jessica claimed she was too emotionally overwhelmed to help, leaving most sorting responsibilities entirely to me once again. 3 weeks into this process, I discovered a locked cedar chest tucked inside my mother's bedroom closet corner. Using an old key found inside her jewelry box, I finally managed to open that mysterious chest late one evening. Inside, beneath folded quilts and old photographs, I found several leather-bound diaries spanning decades of my mother's private thoughts. I hesitated before opening them, uncertain whether reading my mother's private words felt appropriate given our complicated relationship. Eventually, curiosity overcame hesitation, and I began reading entries starting from the earliest diary dated shortly after my birth. The early entries described genuine excitement about motherhood, filled with tender observations about my infant personality and early development. As I continued reading, I noticed my mother's tone shifting gradually once Jessica was born 2 years later. She wrote extensively about struggling to bond with Jessica, describing her as manipulative even during early toddler years. I felt confused reading these entries, since my mother had always publicly presented Jessica as effortlessly sweet and easy. Continuing through subsequent diaries, I discovered increasingly troubling entries describing specific incidents involving Jessica's dishonesty and manipulation tactics. My mother wrote about catching Jessica lying repeatedly, blaming me for things Jessica had actually done herself throughout childhood. One entry described an incident where Jessica broke a valuable heirloom vase, then convincingly blamed me before our father arrived. My mother wrote that she knew the truth but allowed the blame to fall on me to avoid confrontation. Reading that specific entry, I remembered that exact incident vividly, remembering being punished despite genuinely insisting I was innocent. Another entry described Jessica manipulating teachers, friends, and eventually boyfriends throughout her teenage years using calculated emotional manipulation techniques. My mother wrote that she recognized these patterns clearly but felt too exhausted to challenge Jessica's carefully constructed persona. She admitted believing it was simply easier to let people believe I was the difficult, complicated daughter instead. My hands trembled holding that diary, understanding finally why an unfair reputation had followed me throughout my entire life. I continued reading, discovering entries describing my genuine accomplishments alongside private admissions of pride she rarely expressed openly. My mother wrote about feeling guilty watching me internalize blame for situations she privately knew Jessica had actually caused. Despite this private guilt, she never once corrected the public narrative, allowing convenience to outweigh fairness for decades. I found entries from my college years describing genuine pride in my achievements, contradicting everything she said publicly instead. Reading further, I discovered my mother's private acknowledgement that Jessica's caregiving during her final illness was mostly performative. She wrote specifically about noticing my exhaustion, my sacrifice, and my consistent presence despite lacking public recognition throughout everything. One particularly painful entry described her fear that correcting the narrative now would create unbearable family conflict before death. She essentially chose comfortable silence over confronting decades of unfair treatment, protecting her own peace instead of protecting mine. I sat on that closet floor for hours, processing decades of misplaced blame finally explained through my mother's private admissions. Anger eventually replaced initial shock, though I forced myself to remain composed before deciding how to handle this discovery. I photographed every relevant diary entry carefully, preserving evidence before deciding exactly how to address this painful family revelation. I considered confronting Jessica privately, though something told me a private confrontation would simply result in denial and manipulation. I remembered my mother's diary describing Jessica's skill at twisting situations, making herself appear victimized during any confrontation. I realized public truth, shared carefully and calmly, would prevent Jessica from manipulating the narrative once again successfully. The upcoming reading of my mother's will, scheduled for the following month, would gather our entire extended family together. That formal setting, I decided, would become the appropriate place to finally share the truth my mother had hidden. I spent the following weeks organizing diary excerpts chronologically, creating clear timelines proving decades of documented family manipulation. I consulted my therapist regularly, ensuring my approach remained focused on truth rather than revenge or emotional retaliation. She encouraged me to prioritize clarity and calm delivery, allowing the diary's own words to speak for themselves. I also reached out to my cousin Rebecca, someone who had always privately expressed doubts about Jessica's constructed reputation. Rebecca agreed to attend the will reading, offering quiet support, while I prepared to reveal difficult family truths publicly. 2 weeks before the meeting, Jessica called me casually, discussing funeral expenses and suggesting she handle mother's remaining estate alone. Her confident, entitled tone confirmed everything my mother's diary had described about Jessica's manipulative approach toward family matters. I remained calm during that call, agreeing vaguely while internally finalizing my plans for the upcoming will reading confrontation. The night before the meeting, I reread key diary passages one final time, ensuring I understood every relevant detail clearly. I printed multiple copies of the most significant entries, organizing them neatly inside a professional folder for distribution. I barely slept that night, nervous energy mixing uncomfortably with quiet determination about finally revealing long-hidden family truths. The morning of the will reading arrived cloudy and cool, matching the heavy emotional weight I carried throughout that day. I dressed carefully, wanting to appear composed and professional rather than emotional when the confrontation eventually unfolded that afternoon. Rebecca picked me up, squeezing my hand supportively, reminding me the truth deserved acknowledgement after decades of unfair silence. We arrived at the law office where relatives had already gathered, including Jessica, aunts, uncles, and several family friends. Jessica greeted everyone warmly, playing her familiar role as the devoted, grieving daughter who had sacrificed everything for mother. I sat quietly, holding my folder, watching Jessica accept condolences and praise from relatives unaware of what awaited them. The attorney began reading my mother's will, detailing modest financial assets divided relatively equally between Jessica and myself. Then, the attorney mentioned my mother had left a personal letter, requesting it be read aloud during this specific gathering. The room grew quiet as the attorney unfolded the letter, clearing his throat before beginning to read my mother's words. My mother's letter began by acknowledging she had made significant mistakes regarding how she treated her two daughters differently. She wrote that fairness had been sacrificed repeatedly for convenience, admitting she allowed an unfair narrative to persist for decades. Relatives shifted uncomfortably as the attorney continued reading increasingly specific admissions about favoritism and misplaced blame within our family. The letter explicitly named several incidents where Jessica's dishonesty had been blamed unfairly on me throughout our shared childhood. Jessica's confident expression faltered slightly as relatives began glancing curiously between her and the attorney reading these revelations aloud. My mother's letter specifically apologized to me by name, acknowledging decades of unfair criticism and diminished public recognition. She wrote that she hoped this letter might finally correct a narrative she had allowed to persist far too long. Gasps rippled through the room as relatives realized the difficult daughter reputation had been built on deliberate parental deception. Once the attorney finished reading, I stood calmly, opening my folder to share supporting evidence from my mother's diaries. I explained I had discovered several diaries confirming everything mentioned within my mother's final written letter and admission. I distributed photocopied diary excerpts among close relatives, allowing them to read my mother's own words directly themselves. Aunt Patricia read the vase incident aloud, visibly shaken realizing she had blamed me publicly for something Jessica actually caused. Jessica attempted interrupting, insisting the diary entries were taken out of context or possibly misremembered by our aging mother. I calmly reminded everyone that multiple diaries, spanning years, contained consistent detailed accounts describing the same specific behavioral patterns. Rebecca spoke up, confirming she had always privately suspected something felt inconsistent about Jessica's carefully maintained public reputation. Other relatives began recalling similar suspicious incidents, admitting they had noticed inconsistencies but never felt comfortable questioning them directly. Jessica's face flushed red, her confident composure crumbling as decades of carefully constructed reputation began unraveling publicly around her. She attempted shifting blame toward me, accusing me of manipulating our dying mother into writing false accusatory statements somehow. I calmly reminded her that diary entries dated back decades, long before our mother's final illness, or any supposed manipulation. Uncle Robert stood up, admitting he always felt uncomfortable with how differently our family treated Jessica compared to me. The attorney confirmed the letter and diaries had been properly authenticated, verified through handwriting analysis requested earlier by our mother. Jessica's composure completely collapsed as she realized denial was no longer a viable option within that formal legal setting. She finally admitted, quietly and reluctantly, that she had occasionally shifted blame onto me throughout our shared childhood years. Hearing her admission felt surreal, considering decades spent internalizing blame for behaviors I genuinely never actually committed myself. I told her calmly that acknowledgement, though decades overdue, still mattered significantly toward finally understanding our complicated family history. Several relatives apologized directly to me, admitting they had unfairly judged me based entirely on false family narratives. I accepted these apologies graciously, understanding they too had been manipulated by carefully constructed appearances maintained for years. The meeting ended awkwardly, relatives leaving quietly, processing uncomfortable truths that had unexpectedly emerged during a routine legal proceeding. Jessica left without speaking to me, clearly overwhelmed by public exposure of decades-long family manipulation and deception. Rebecca drove me home, both of us mostly silent, processing everything that had unfolded during that emotional legal meeting. That evening, my phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from relatives expressing genuine support and long overdue understanding finally. I felt strangely calm, having finally released truth I had carried silently since childhood without proper acknowledgement or validation. 3 days later, Jessica texted me, apologizing briefly, admitting she felt genuinely ashamed once truth became impossible to hide. I appreciated her apology, though I told her healing our relationship would require significantly more than a single brief message. Over the following months, several relatives reached out individually, apologizing for years of unfair comparisons and misplaced judgment. I began therapy sessions specifically focused on processing decades of internalized blame, now finally validated through undeniable written evidence. My therapist helped me understand that healing required separating my own self-worth from years of distorted family narrative. I started rebuilding relationships selectively, prioritizing relatives who demonstrated genuine understanding rather than superficial apologies offered out of guilt. Rebecca became an increasingly important figure in my life, offering consistent support throughout this difficult emotional transition period. I continued excelling professionally, finally allowing myself to fully celebrate achievements without anticipating dismissive family reactions or comparisons. 6 months after the will reading, Jessica reached out again, requesting a private meeting to discuss our complicated relationship honestly. We met at a quiet coffee shop, both nervous, navigating unfamiliar territory after decades of distorted sibling dynamics. Jessica admitted, tearfully, that she had genuinely believed her own manipulated version of events for most of our childhood. She explained feeling immense pressure to maintain a perfect image, leading her toward manipulation as a coping survival mechanism. Hearing her perspective didn't excuse decades of unfair blame, but it helped humanize someone I had resented for years. I told her honestly that rebuilding trust would require consistent honesty, not simply occasional emotional admissions during difficult moments. She agreed, promising genuine effort toward transparency, understanding our relationship required rebuilding from an entirely honest foundation moving forward. Our conversations remained cautious over the following year, though something resembling genuine understanding slowly replaced decades of quiet resentment. I visited my mother's grave several times that year, updating her quietly on everything happening within our complicated family. I told her I finally understood why she struggled internally, though I still wish she had corrected things sooner. Standing there, I forgave her privately, understanding forgiveness protected my own peace rather than excusing decades of unfair silence. I also promised myself I would never again allow silence to protect convenience at the expense of my own truth. A year after the will reading, I received a promotion at my design firm, finally celebrated genuinely by supportive colleagues. Several relatives attended a small celebration dinner, openly acknowledging accomplishments they had previously dismissed or minimized for years. Aunt Patricia specifically apologized again, admitting she now understood how deeply unfair assumptions had affected my self-worth throughout childhood. I accepted her apology warmly, appreciating genuine reflection rather than superficial acknowledgement offered simply to ease collective family guilt. Jessica attended that celebration too, sitting quietly, offering genuine congratulations without attempting to redirect attention toward herself instead. Watching her genuine restraint felt like meaningful progress, proving people could change once forced to confront uncomfortable personal truths. Our relationship remained imperfect, but honesty gradually replaced decades of manipulation, comparison, and unfair childhood favoritism between us. I learned that reputations built on convenience eventually crumble once truth finds its way into proper daylight and evidence. I began speaking occasionally at local workshops, sharing my story anonymously to help others recognize similar unhealthy family dynamics. Hearing others recognize themselves within my story reminded me that healing sometimes requires simply speaking uncomfortable truths aloud. 2 years after discovering that diary, I finally felt fully at peace with my complicated, painful family history overall. I no longer needed external validation to understand my own worth, having reclaimed my identity beyond childhood labels finally. Jessica and I now speak monthly, our relationship rebuilding slowly through consistent honesty rather than convenient, comfortable avoidance. She occasionally acknowledges specific childhood incidents, unprompted, small gestures proving genuine accountability rather than performative surface-level apology. I keep my mother's diaries safely stored, not as weapons, but as proof that truth eventually finds its way forward. Sometimes, I reread specific entries, grateful my mother eventually found courage to acknowledge decades of unfair treatment before dying. I understand now that her silence, though painful, stemmed from her own exhaustion rather than genuine malice toward me. Forgiving her fully took time, though understanding her humanity helped soften decades of accumulated resentment I once carried heavily. My relationship with Rebecca deepened significantly, becoming one of the most genuine, unconditional connections throughout my entire adult life. I learned that chosen family sometimes provides validation biological family members remain unable or unwilling to offer consistently. Standing today, professionally successful, emotionally healed, and finally understood, I recognize my worth was never truly negotiable or conditional. That old cedar chest, once hidden inside a closet, ultimately became the exact catalyst needed for long overdue family healing. I walked away from that painful discovery stronger, wiser, and finally unwilling to accept unfair labels without questioning their origin. My story isn't simply about vindication. It's about reclaiming identity after decades of quiet, unacknowledged childhood emotional mislabeling. If you've ever been unfairly labeled within your own family, remember reputations built on convenience rarely survive genuine scrutiny. Speaking uncomfortable truths, even years later, sometimes becomes the exact catalyst needed for lasting healing and authentic reconciliation. I closed that difficult chapter finally at peace, understanding sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply seek truth.